Two children were playing on a frozen lake when a terrible accident happens, feeling guilty. One of them makes a wish to Santa Claus that leaves him shocked. The smell of cinnamon cookies filled the Morgan family's home, yet not even the festive aroma could calm Sophie's restless heart. At 9 years old, she was pure contained energy, her blue eyes sparkling with the promise of adventure. "Claire, come here," Sophie whispered, pulling her 7-year-old sister behind the towering Christmas tree. Claire, with her golden curls and wide eyes, hesitated. "What is it, Sophie?" "Mom said we're not supposed to touch the presents." Sophie rolled her eyes, impatient. "Forget the presents. I have an amazing idea for tomorrow." The sisters were like oil and water. Sophie, all courage and impulsiveness. Claire, the voice of reason, always cautious. Still, the bond between them was unbreakable. "What idea?" Claire asked, curiosity winning out over fear. Sophie leaned in, whispering with almost palpable excitement, "We're going ice skating on the frozen lake tomorrow morning, before anyone wakes up." Claire's face went pale in an instant. "But Mom said the lake is dangerous in winter. It's going to be incredible. We'll be the first ones to leave our marks on that fresh, new ice," Sophie argued, her eyes gleaming at the thought of the forbidden adventure. At that moment, Anne, the girl's mother, entered the room carrying a tray of steaming cookies. "What are you two whispering about?" Sophie stood up straight in a flash, an innocent smile masking her intentions. "Nothing, Mom. Just trying to guess what's inside the presents." Anne raised an eyebrow, well aware of the mischievous sparkle in her eldest daughter's eyes. "I see. Well, come eat these cookies before they cool down. And remember, no leaving the house tomorrow without telling us. The weather's dangerously cold and the lake is dangerous in winter." "We know, Mum," Sophie finished, exchanging a conspiratorial glance with Claire. As the girls devoured the cookies, Thomas, their father, entered, shaking snow from his coat. "Phew, it's freezing out there. The lake must have a pretty thick layer of ice by now." Sophie nearly choked, her eyes shining with a mix of excitement and danger. This was the signal she'd been waiting for. Her adventure would be even more thrilling than she'd imagined. That night, lying in her bed, Sophie couldn't sleep. Images of ice skates cutting through virgin ice danced in her mind. Next to her, Claire slept soundly, unaware of the whirlwind of emotions that awaited them. A sudden flashback transported Sophie back to the previous summer. The laughter of the two sisters echoed through the warm air as they ran along the shore of that same lake, now frozen. Back then, the water was a refreshing invitation, not a hidden threat beneath a treacherous layer of ice. "Sophie, be careful," Claire's voice echoed in her memory as her younger sister pulled her back from a deeper part of the lake. Returning to the present, Sophie smiled at the dark ceiling. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would show Claire that there was nothing to fear. They would create a new memory, just as vibrant as the summer ones, but with an added taste of conquered danger. The next morning, before the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, Sophie gently shook Claire. "Wake up, sleepyhead. Our adventure awaits." Claire rubbed her sleepy eyes, a mix of excitement and apprehension on her angelic face. "Sophie, are you sure about this?" "Trust me, it's going to be epic," Sophie replied, already putting on her thickest coat and hiding the ice skates in a backpack. The girls snuck through the silent house, their hearts beating in unison with the thrill of their shared secret. Reaching the back door, Sophie paused dramatically, her hand on the doorknob. "Ready for the best adventure of our lives?" Claire swallowed hard, nodding hesitantly. "Ready." With a soft creak that seemed deafening in the pre-dawn silence, the door opened. A white and silent world greeted them, the air so cold it seemed to cut their exposed skin. The lake, a silver stretch under the faint light of dawn, called to them with an almost hypnotic power. Sophie took the first step into the soft snow, leaving a perfect footprint. Claire followed, her smaller steps creating a parallel path. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle crunch of snow under their feet. As they approached the lake's edge, Sophie's excitement grew exponentially. She could almost feel the skates gliding over the untouched ice, the freedom, the adrenaline. Claire, however, felt her stomach tighten with a mix of fear and anticipation. "Sophie," Claire whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What if the ice isn't thick enough?" Sophie stopped, turning to face her sister. For a moment, a shadow of doubt crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by her usual confidence. "It'll be fine, Claire. I promise. I'll take care of you." The words hung in the freezing air, a promise that would echo in the days, weeks, and years to come. At that moment, standing at the edge of the frozen lake, the two sisters were on the brink of something much bigger than they could imagine. Sophie took another step forward, the ice creaking softly under her weight. A triumphant smile lit up her face. "See, solid as a rock. Come on, Claire." Claire hesitated for one more second before following her sister. The ice was like a mirror beneath their feet, reflecting the sky that was beginning to lighten. Little did they know that those first steps on the ice would mark the beginning of a journey that would test not only their courage, but also the power of love, guilt, and redemption. What would happen in the next moments would change their lives forever, in ways neither could predict. As the girls moved closer to the center of the lake, the ice beneath their feet seemed to whisper secrets. Secrets of imminent danger, of fateful choices, and of a Christmas wish that would echo through time, reshaping the destiny of everyone around them. What will happen when the thin ice can no longer support the weight of their dreams and fears? And how could a simple act of courage, or was it recklessness, trigger a series of events that would transform not just their lives, but the entire community? The adventure had only just begun, and fate was about to show its hand. The sun had barely touched the horizon when Sophie and Claire reached the shore of the frozen lake. The landscape was breathtaking, a vast, immaculate white expanse reflecting the first golden rays of morning. The air was so cold it felt as if it could crystallize with each breath. Sophie, her eyes shining with excitement, quickly began putting on her skates. "Come on, Claire, look how perfect it is." Claire, however, hesitated. Her large brown eyes scanned the lake's surface, catching small reflections and shadows in the ice that seemed to scream, "Danger." "Sophie, I'm not sure. It looks so thin in some places." "Oh, stop being such a scaredy cat," Sophie laughed, already standing on her skates. "Dad said yesterday that the ice was thick. It'll be fine." Reluctantly, Claire began putting on her own skates, her hands shaking slightly, not just from the cold. Sophie was the first to glide onto the ice, her movements graceful and confident. She spun around, laughing out loud, her voice echoing in the morning silence. "Come on, Claire, it's amazing." Claire took her first hesitant steps on the ice. Despite her fear, she couldn't help but smile at the smoothness beneath her feet. It was like floating. The girls skated for a few minutes, their laughter mingling with the gentle sound of blades on ice. The landscape around them was out of a fairy tale, trees covered in snow, their branches like delicate crystal sculptures, small snowdrifts glimmering like diamonds under the rising sun. But as they moved toward the center of the lake, Claire could not ignore the growing sensation that something was wrong. The ice beneath her feet felt thinner, more alive. "Sophie," she called, her voice trembling, "I think we should go back. It's making strange sounds." Sophie, a few meters ahead, turned around with a defiant smile. "You're imagining things, Claire. Come on, let's reach that little snowy island over there." That was when the first crack echoed, loud and threatening. Both sisters froze in place, their hearts pounding. "Sophie," Claire whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Calm down," Sophie replied, trying to maintain her composure, though her own fear was starting to show. Let's go back very slowly, okay?" They began moving slowly toward the shore, each step accompanied by small cracks and groans from the ice. The surface beneath their feet, once so solid, now seemed alive and treacherous. Suddenly, a loud sound like thunder ripped through the air. A fissure began to form between the two sisters, snaking through the ice like slow-motion lightning. "Claire!" Sophie shouted, extending her hand toward her younger sister. Time seemed to slow down. Claire, her eyes wide with terror, watched the fissure expand rapidly. In a fraction of a second, she made a decision that would change their lives forever. Summoning every bit of strength her small body possessed, Claire pushed Sophie away, toward the firmer part of the ice. At the same instant, the ice under Claire's own feet gave way. Sophie's scream tore through the cold morning air as she watched her sister vanish into the icy water. "Claire, no!" Desperate, Sophie tried to approach the hole, but the ice continued to crack beneath her weight. She called Claire's name repeatedly, tears freezing on her cheeks. The water was so cold that Claire could barely breathe. The thermal shock made her body seize up instantly. She struggled to stay afloat, her fingers slipping on the sharp edge of the ice. Sophie!" she managed to stammer between chattering teeth. "Help!" Sophie, paralyzed by terror and guilt, finally snapped into action. She lay down on the ice, distributing her weight, and began crawling toward the hole. "Hang on, Claire!" "I'm coming." But every movement made the ice moan dangerously. Sophie could see Claire's pale face, her lips already turning blue from the extreme cold. She was so close, yet so far. "Help!" Sophie shouted with all the strength in her lungs. "Someone help me, please!" Her cries echoed across the frozen landscape, seemingly unanswered. Time was running out. Claire struggled more and more to keep her head above the water, her strength fading by the second. "Claire, look at me," Sophie begged, tears now flowing freely down her face. "Don't give up. Please, don't give up." At that moment, as if the universe had finally heard her desperate pleas, distant voices and hurried footsteps reached Sophie's ears. "Over here," she shouted, her voice hoarse. "We're here, hurry." As the voices drew closer, Sophie turned her attention back to Claire. Her little sister could barely keep her head above the water now. "Claire, hang on just a little longer," Sophie implored, stretching as far as she could, her fingers almost touching Claire's. "They're coming to help. Please don't leave me." Claire's eyes met Sophie's one last time, filled with fear but also with unconditional love. Then, silently, she disappeared beneath the icy surface. "No!" Sophie's scream was heart-wrenching, a sound that would forever remain in the memory of everyone who heard it. At that moment, strong hands grabbed Sophie, pulling her back. She struggled violently. "Claire, we have to save Claire." Firefighters and paramedics rushed onto the scene, moving with careful urgency over the treacherous ice. One of them dove into the hole without hesitation, disappearing beneath the surface in search of Claire. Sophie watched, stunned and trembling uncontrollably, as the rescue operation unfolded. Seconds felt like hours. The silence was deafening, broken only by the urgent commands of the rescuers. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the firefighter emerged, carrying Claire's small, motionless body. "We have a pulse, but it's very weak," he shouted, passing Claire to the waiting paramedics. While the medical team worked frantically to revive Claire, Sophie remained in shock, unable to process what was happening. Her morning's adventure had turned into the worst nightmare imaginable. Sirens cut through the air, announcing the arrival of more help. Claire was quickly placed in an ambulance, machines beeping, doctors shouting words Sophie couldn't understand. As the ambulance sped away, Sophie stood there, trembling under the blanket someone had placed over her shoulders. Guilt, fear, and uncertainty consumed her. The lake, once a winter playground in her dreams, now seemed like a sleeping monster waiting to claim more victims. And Sophie knew deep in her heart that nothing would ever be the same again. As she was gently guided away from the accident scene, Sophie made a silent promise to herself and to Claire. If her sister survived, she would do anything at all, to fix what she had done. Little did she know that this promise would lead her to an extraordinary encounter and a Christmas wish that would change not only their lives, but the entire community in ways no one could foresee. Sophie's scream tore through the icy morning air, echoing across the wintry landscape. Her feet sank into the deep snow as she ran toward the nearest houses, panic fueling each desperate step. "Help! Somebody help!" she cried, her voice raw and broken. "My sister! The lake! Please!" Tears froze on her cheeks as she stumbled and fell, rising immediately to continue her frantic race. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity, as the image of Claire disappearing under the ice replayed in her mind. Finally, a light turned on in one of the houses. The door opened, and a man in a robe rushed outside. "What happened, child?" he asked. alarmed by Sophie's disheveled, panic-stricken appearance. "My sister," Sophie gasped, frantically pointing toward the lake. "She fell in the lake. The ice broke. Please, help." The man did not hesitate. Calling to his wife to phone the fire department, he ran back inside, emerging seconds later with blankets and ropes. "Show me where," he said, running alongside Sophie back toward the lake. Other neighbors, alerted by Sophie's screams, began emerging from their homes. The news spread quickly, and soon a small group of people was heading toward the lake, carrying whatever they thought might be useful. Sophie led them to the spot where Claire had fallen. The hole in the ice looked like a dark wound on the bright white surface. There was no sign of Claire. "There!" Sophie cried, pointing with trembling hands. Two men ventured carefully onto the ice, secured with ropes. They probed the dark water with long branches, calling Claire's name. Sophie watched, her entire body trembling, not just from the cold, but from a fear so deep it seemed to consume her from within. "Please," she whispered over and over. "Please, please." The distant sound of sirens cut through the air, growing louder. Seconds later, the firefighters arrived, followed closely by an ambulance. The scene exploded into activity. Trained firefighters took control, gently pushing aside the well-intentioned but amateur neighbors. They moved with calculated urgency, every movement precise and purposeful. "How long has she been submerged?" a firefighter asked Sophie. Sophie stammered a reply, her mind a whirlwind of guilt and fear. I don't know. "A few minutes." "Oh God, please save her." Two firefighters, dressed in immersion suits, entered the icy water. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by muffled sounds of rescue equipment and the whispered prayers of onlookers. Sophie watched, paralyzed, her eyes fixed on the hole in the ice. Each second felt like an eternity. She barely breathed, her entire body tense with agonizing suspense. Suddenly, there was movement. One of the firefighters emerged, holding a small still body. "We've got her!" he shouted. A collective gasp of relief rippled through the crowd, but Sophie remained silent, her eyes wide as she stared at Claire's pale, motionless form. The paramedics sprang into action immediately. Claire was placed on a stretcher, her bluish skin a shocking contrast against the white snow. They began resuscitation efforts right there on the shore of the lake. Sophie watched, unable to move, as the doctors worked frantically on Claire's body. Chest compressions, artificial respiration, medical terms she didn't understand filled the air. "Come on, little one," she heard a paramedic murmur. "Fight." Seconds dragged on. Sophie felt as if the entire world had stopped, focused solely on that small body by the lake's edge. She wanted to scream, beg Claire to wake up, but no sound came from her throat. Then, suddenly, one of the paramedics shouted, "We have a pulse." A wave of relief swept through the crowd, but Sophie barely registered it. Her eyes were fixed on Claire, desperately searching for any sign of life. Claire was quickly wrapped in thermal blankets and placed into the ambulance. The paramedics continued to work tirelessly, administering oxygen and monitoring her vital signs. Only when the ambulance door closed did reality finally hit Sophie. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to her knees in the snow, violent sobs shaking her body. "It's my fault," she cried, the words nearly unintelligible between sobs. "All my fault." A gentle hand touched her shoulder. It was the neighbor who had called for help. "Come on, dear," she said softly. "We need to take you to the hospital too." Sophie let herself be guided into a car, her body moving automatically while her mind replayed the morning's events in a torturous loop. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur, the outside world just an indistinct scene beyond the car window. At the hospital, Sophie was wrapped in warm blankets, a kind nurse checking her temperature and signs of hypothermia. But Sophie barely registered what was happening. Her eyes were fixed on the emergency room doors through which Claire had been taken. Minutes stretched into hours. Sophie remained seated, motionless, her face a mask of shock and guilt. Occasionally, a sob escaped her lips, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of the waiting room. Finally, her parents arrived, their faces pale with worry and fear. Upon seeing Sophie, Anne ran to embrace her, tears flowing freely down her face. "Oh, Sophie," she sobbed, holding her daughter tightly. "What happened? How?" But Sophie couldn't answer. Words got stuck in her throat, choked by the overwhelming guilt crushing her. Thomas knelt beside them, his voice trembling as he asked, "Any news about Claire?" Sophie only shook her head, unable to meet her father's eyes. The following hours were torture. The Morgan family waited, united in their fear and hope, for any news about Claire. Doctors came and went, their serious faces and carefully chosen words offering little comfort. Sophie remained silent, curled up in her chair, eyes fixed on the floor. In her mind, she relived every moment of that fateful morning, every decision that led to the accident. Guilt consumed her, a weight so heavy she could barely breathe. As night fell outside, the waiting room became its own world, suspended in time and space. At the center of that world, Sophie made a silent promise to herself and to Claire. If her sister survived, she would do anything to fix what she had done. Little did she know that this promise would lead her to an extraordinary encounter and a Christmas wish that would change not only their lives, but the entire community in ways no one could predict. The ambulance siren cut through the cold morning air, its piercing sound echoing through the sleepy town. Inside, a silent battle against time was unfolding. Claire, small and pale, lay motionless on the stretcher, surrounded by paramedics working frantically. "Body temperature, 28 degrees C," announced one of the paramedics, his voice tense. "We need to warm her up, fast." Thermal blankets wrapped around Claire's fragile body, while warmed IV fluids were administered. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the cramped space, each beep a precarious reminder of Claire's fight for life. In the front seat, Sophie sat silently, her eyes glazed, fixed on a point only she could see. Shock and guilt consumed her, making her oblivious to the chaos around her. In her mind, the morning's events replayed in an endless loop. The ambulance skidded into the hospital parking lot, doors opening before the vehicle had fully stopped. A team of doctors and nurses were already waiting, ready to act. 7-year-old girl, submerged in icy water for about 5 minutes, a paramedic reported quickly as he pushed the stretcher. Low body temperature, assisted breathing, weak but present heartbeat. Claire was rushed into the emergency room, leaving Sophie standing alone in the cold, sterile corridor. A nurse gently guided her to the waiting area, wrapping a warm blanket around her. Moments later, the ER doors swung open violently. Anne and Thomas Morgan burst in, their faces twisted with fear and concern. "Where is she? Where is our daughter?" Anne cried, her eyes scanning the environment frantically. A doctor approached, his face grave. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, please, come with me." Sophie watched her parents being led into a private room, muffled voices escaping through the half-open door. Fragments of conversation reached her ears. Critical condition, severe hypothermia, possible brain damage. Each word was like a dagger to Sophie's heart. She shrank further into her chair, wishing she could disappear. Moments later, Anne emerged from the room, her face pale and stained with tears. Seeing Sophie, she rushed over to hug her. "Oh, Sophie," Anne sobbed, holding her daughter tight. "What happened? How did you end up at the lake?" Sophie opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. How could she explain? How could she tell her parents that her recklessness had nearly cost Claire's life? Thomas joined them, his face a mask of worry. "The doctors are doing everything they can," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now we can only wait and pray." The next hours dragged on like eternity. The Morgan family remained in the waiting room, united in their fear and hope. Occasionally, a doctor or nurse would appear with updates, each word carefully chosen. "We're working on gradually raising her body temperature," one of the doctors explained. "The biggest challenge now is avoiding rewarming shock." Sophie listened in silence, each word increasing the weight of her guilt. She wanted to scream, beg forgiveness, do anything to undo what had happened. As night fell outside, Dr. Leclerc, the physician responsible for Claire's case, approached the family. His face was serious, but there was a hint of hope in his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan," he began, his voice calm and professional. We've managed to stabilize Claire, but she's not out of danger yet. The next 24 hours will be critical." Anne stifled a sob, clinging to Thomas for support. Sophie felt her heart tighten even more. What exactly does that mean, Doctor?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Leclerc sighed softly. "It means we still don't know the full extent of the damage. Claire's brain was deprived of oxygen for a significant time. Plus, severe hypothermia may have affected other organs. We're monitoring her closely, but only time will tell." The words hung in the air, heavy and threatening. Sophie felt as if the ground were disappearing beneath her feet. The possibility that Claire might never fully recover was more than she could bear. Can I see her?" Sophie asked, her voice almost inaudible. The doctor hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Just a few minutes. She's in the ICU and needs absolute rest." Sophie followed the doctor through the silent hospital corridors, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. When they reached the ICU, she saw Claire through the glass, small, pale, surrounded by machines and tubes. "Oh, Claire," Sophie whispered, tears finally escaping. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." At that moment, watching her sister fighting for her life, Sophie made a silent promise. If Claire survived, she would do anything at all, to fix what she had done. Little did she know that this promise would lead her to an extraordinary encounter and a Christmas wish that would change not only their lives, but the lives of everyone in the community, in ways nobody could foresee. As night wore on, the Morgan family prepared for the longest and most agonizing vigil of their lives. The next 24 hours would determine not only Claire's fate, but the future of the entire family. And Sophie, consumed by guilt and fear, could not imagine that her greatest challenge and her redemption were still ahead of her. The days dragged on in the hospital, each one seeming longer than the last. Claire's ICU room became the center of the Morgan family's universe, a place where hope and fear coexisted in a precarious balance. Claire remained motionless in her bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed constantly. Her closed eyes and pale skin contrasted painfully with her golden hair spread across the pillow. The doctors called her state a coma, a word that hung over the family like a dark cloud. Sophie, consumed by guilt, could barely look at her sister. She avoided visiting the hospital whenever possible, making excuses to stay home. When forced to come, she would remain in the far corner of the room, eyes fixed on the floor, unable to face the result of her recklessness. On one of these rare visits, Anne found Sophie curled up in a chair far from Claire's bed. "Honey," Anne said softly, approaching her eldest daughter, "why don't you come hold your sister's hand? The doctors say she might feel our presence." Sophie shuddered visibly. I can't, Mom," she whispered, her voice choked. "It's my fault. All of this is my fault." Anne sat beside Sophie, wrapping her in a tight hug. "Oh, Sophie, it was a terrible accident, but it wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known." "But I did know," Sophie interrupted, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Mom, I convinced Claire to go to the lake. She didn't want to go, but I insisted. If I had listened to her." Anne was silent for a moment, processing the revelation. Her heart ached for both daughters, Claire fighting for her life and Sophie drowning in guilt. "Sophie, look at me," Anne said finally, her voice firm but gentle. "What happened was a terrible accident. Yes, you made a mistake by going to the lake, but you didn't want this to happen. Claire needs you now. We all need each other." Sophie looked at her mother, her eyes full of pain and regret. "How can I help Claire after what I did?" "By being here," Anne answered simply. "By talking to her, holding her hand, showing that you love her." Reluctantly, Sophie allowed herself to be guided to Claire's bedside. With trembling hands, she touched her sister's cold fingers. "Hi, Claire," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. I'm so sorry. Please wake up. Please." Meanwhile, Thomas Morgan dealt with the situation the only way he knew how, by throwing himself into work. He spent long hours at the office, arriving at the hospital late at night, with dark circles under his eyes and slumped shoulders. "How is she?" he asked invariably upon entering the room, his eyes scanning the monitor beside Claire's bed for any sign of change. "No change," Anne replied, exhaustion evident in her voice. The doctors say that's a good sign. She's stable. Thomas would nod silently, sitting heavily in the chair beside the bed. The heavy silence was broken only by the steady beep of the machines. As the days turned into weeks, tensions in the Morgan family began to rise. The prolonged stress and constant uncertainty took their toll. One night, after Sophie had gone home, Anne confronted Thomas in the hospital corridor. "You need to be more present, Thomas," she said, her voice a mix of frustration and plea. "The girls need you. I need you." Thomas ran his hand over his tired face. "I'm doing what I can, Anne. Someone has to keep the bills paid. Insurance doesn't cover all this." "It's not just about money," Anne exclaimed, her voice rising. "It's about being here, about being a family." Her argument was cut short by a nurse who hurried past, giving them a censorious look. Ashamed, they fell silent, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words and repressed emotions. At home, Sophie heard her parents' muffled arguments, feeling even more guilty for causing so much suffering. She took refuge in her room, flipping through old photo albums, reliving happy moments with Claire. One photo in particular caught her attention. She and Claire the previous Christmas, smiling by the decorated tree. Sophie traced the outline of Claire's smiling face with her finger, an idea forming in her mind. "What if," she murmured to herself, a spark of hope igniting in her chest for the first time in weeks. That night, while the house slept, Sophie crept into the living room. Sitting at the kitchen table, she began to write, words flowing from her pen with desperate urgency. "Dear Santa Claus," she began, tears falling silently onto the paper. "I know I haven't been a good girl this year, but please, I'm not asking for anything for myself. It's for my sister, Claire." Sophie wrote until dawn, pouring her heart and guilt onto the paper. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and hid it in her pocket. Little did she know that this letter, born from her despair and remorse, would be the catalyst for events that would change not only her life, but the entire community. As the sun rose, bringing another day of anguished waiting, Sophie clung to her new mission. She would find a way to get her request to Santa Claus no matter the cost. Because now, more than ever, she needed to believe in miracles. Christmas Eve arrived, bringing a surreal atmosphere to the hospital. Garlands and colorful lights decorated the corridors, a striking contrast to the somber mood that hung over the Morgan family. In Claire's room, a small Christmas tree twinkled silently, its lights reflecting off the medical equipment that kept the girl alive. Sophie watched it all with vacant eyes, sitting in her usual chair in the corner of the room. The weeks of waiting and guilt had left visible marks on her, deep dark circles, slumped shoulders, a gaze that seemed to have aged years in just 1 month. It was in that moment of despair that an idea began to form in her mind. If medicine couldn't help Claire, maybe it was time to appeal to something more magical. That night, back in the silent, cold house, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, a blank sheet of paper in front of her. With trembling hands, she began to write, "Dear Santa Claus, I know I don't deserve anything this year. I've been a very bad girl. Because of me, my little sister Claire is in the hospital, asleep for weeks without waking up. The doctors say she might never wake up again. Santa Claus, I'm not asking for anything for myself. I just want Claire to wake up. Please make her well again. I promise I will never disobey again. I'll be the best sister in the world. I'll do anything, anything at all. I know Christmas is tomorrow and you must be very busy, but Claire always believed in you, even when other kids said you didn't exist. She deserves a miracle. Please, Santa Claus, save my sister. With all my regret and hope, Sophie." Tears fell onto the paper as Sophie wrote, smudging the ink in some places. When she finished, she read the letter several times, putting all her heart and hope into each word. Looking at the clock, Sophie saw that it was already past midnight. It was officially Christmas. With a determination she hadn't felt in weeks, she put on her warmest coat, tucked the letter into her pocket, and silently left the house. The streets were deserted and covered in snow. Frosty flakes fell gently, giving the town an ethereal, almost magical air. Sophie walked quickly, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but something inside her said she needed to find Santa Claus, no matter how. After wandering for almost an hour, her fingers and nose numb from the cold, Sophie was about to give up when she saw a figure in red turning the corner. Her heart jumped. Could it be possible? Running as fast as her frozen legs allowed, Sophie caught up with the figure. It was a man dressed as Santa Claus, carrying a sack of presents. In reality, it was Paul, the firefighter who had rescued Claire, making his annual gift deliveries to needy children. But to Sophie, at that moment, he was the personification of all her hope. "Santa Claus!" she shouted, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Please wait!" Paul turned, surprised to see a child alone in the street at this hour. Recognizing Sophie, he felt a pang in his heart. "Ho, ho, ho," he said, staying in character. "What are you doing out here so late, little one?" Sophie, panting and trembling, pulled the crumpled letter from her pocket. "Please, Santa Claus. It's for my sister Claire. You must read it. Now, please." The urgency in Sophie's voice made Paul hesitate. Still playing Santa, he took the letter and began to read. As his eyes scanned Sophie's desperate words, his expression shifted from surprise to shock, and finally to deep compassion. "Oh, Sophie," he murmured, momentarily forgetting his role. Sophie, mistaking the emotion in his voice for Santa's magic, clutched the hem of his red suit. "You can help, can't you? You can save Claire, right?" Paul knelt in the snow, bringing himself to Sophie's eye level. His heart ached for the girl before him, so young and carrying such a heavy burden. "Sophie," he began gently, "Santa Claus can't promise medical miracles, but I can promise that Claire is getting the best possible care." Seeing the disappointment in Sophie's eyes, he continued quickly, "But the magic of Christmas isn't only about presents or miracles. It's in the love, hope, and kindness we show one another. And you, Sophie, are showing all that love for your sister." Sophie sniffled, tears freezing on her cheeks. "But what if it's not enough?" Paul placed a reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is our love and presence. Keep believing in Claire, keep showing your love. That's more powerful than any magic." Sophie nodded slowly, absorbing his words. There was something familiar and comforting in Santa's voice, something that calmed her tormented heart. "Now," Paul said, standing up, "let's get you home. Your parents must be worried." He accompanied Sophie back, maintaining a gentle conversation about hope and the Christmas spirit. When they reached the Morgan home, Sophie turned to him one last time. "Thank you, Santa Claus," she said softly. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Sophie," Paul replied, his heart heavy with the knowledge of the family's challenge. As Sophie entered her house, a mixture of hope and apprehension in her heart, Paul remained standing in the snow for a moment. He knew he couldn't perform miracles, but maybe, just maybe, he could do something to help this devastated family. With that thought, he continued on his way, snow falling softly around him, covering his footprints as if he were a true magical Santa disappearing into the night. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear, a blanket of fresh snow covering the town like a silent quilt. Sophie opened her eyes, feeling a strange blend of hope and anxiety bubbling in her chest. The memory of her encounter with Santa Claus the night before felt almost like a dream, but the sense that something important was about to happen remained. She went downstairs hesitantly, finding her parents in the kitchen. Anne was mechanically preparing breakfast, while Thomas leafed through the newspaper without truly reading it. The mood was grim, so far removed from the Christmas spirit that usually filled the house. "Merry Christmas," Sophie said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. Anne forced a smile, hugging her daughter. "Merry Christmas, honey. We'll have breakfast, then go see Claire, okay?" They had barely sat down at the table when the phone rang, shrill and insistent. Thomas answered, his face going pale and tense. "Hello, yes, this is he. What? But how? Yes, we're on our way." He hung up, turning to Anne and Sophie with wide eyes. "That was the hospital. Claire, there's been a change. We need to go now." Sophie's heart stopped for an instant. A change? What did that mean? Would it be the miracle she had asked for, or... The next minutes were a blur of frantic activity. Coats were thrown on hastily. Keys searched for, doors slammed. Within minutes, they were in the car, Thomas driving through the nearly deserted town with palpable urgency. Sophie clutched her seatbelt, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would escape her chest. She repeated in her mind, like a mantra, "Please, let Claire be okay. Please, let it be a miracle." They arrived at the hospital in record time, racing through the festively decorated halls, a surreal contrast to their anxiety. When they reached Claire's room, they were met by Dr. Leclerc, whose normally serious face wore a tired but genuine smile. "Morgan family," he began, his calm voice tinged with excitement, "I have extraordinary news." Claire woke up. The world seemed to pause for a moment. Anne let out a sob, clinging to Thomas. Sophie stood frozen, unable to process the words she had just heard. Is she okay?" Thomas managed to ask, his voice trembling. Dr. Leclerc nodded. "Considering the circumstances, she's doing incredibly well. She woke up about an hour ago, conscious and responsive. Of course, we still have many tests ahead, but the initial signs are very promising." "Can we see her?" Sophie whispered, finding her voice for the first time. "Of course," the doctor smiled kindly. "She's asking for you. Just be gentle. She's still fragile." Hearts pounding. The family entered the room. There, sitting in bed, pale but with open, bright eyes, was Claire. She looked smaller and more fragile than ever, but the faint smile that lit her face upon seeing her family was the most beautiful thing Sophie had ever seen. "Mom, Dad, Sophie." Claire's voice was hoarse and low, but to her family, it was the sweetest sound in the world. Anne rushed to the bed, wrapping Claire in a gentle embrace, tears streaming freely down her face. Thomas joined them, his voice choked as he murmured words of love and relief. Sophie, however, remained at the door, paralyzed. The joy of seeing Claire awake struggled against the crushing wave of guilt that threatened to engulf her. How could she face her sister after everything that happened? Claire, noticing Sophie's hesitation, extended a weak hand toward her. "Sophie, it's okay. Come here." Those simple words broke the dam. Sophie rushed to the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. "Claire, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It was all my fault. I never should have taken you to the lake. Claire interrupted her, her voice gentle but firm. "Shh, Sophie. It wasn't your fault. It was an accident. I'm here now. We're all okay." The sisters embraced, years of love and understanding passing between them without the need for words. Anne and Thomas joined, and the Morgan family was finally reunited. For a few minutes, the room was filled only with the sound of soft crying and murmurs of affection and relief, as if the outside world had disappeared, leaving only this perfect moment of reunion and healing. Then, gently breaking the moment, there was a knock on the door. The family slowly separated, turning toward the door curiously. Who could it be? The doctors usually didn't knock, and the nurses had already done their rounds. "Come in," Thomas called, discreetly wiping tears from his eyes. The door opened slowly, revealing a figure that made Sophie's eyes widen in recognition and astonishment. There, still dressed in red, stood the Santa Claus from the previous night. Paul the firefighter entered hesitantly, carrying a large red sack. His eyes scanned the scene before settling on Claire, awake and smiling weakly. "Ho, ho, ho," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "It looks like we have a true Christmas miracle here." Sophie looked from Claire to Santa Claus, her heart filling with such intense joy and gratitude that she could barely breathe. Could her letter, her faith, really have worked? As Paul approached the bed, smiling kindly at the reunited family, Sophie felt that something magical and inexplicable had happened. Christmas, which had started with so much sadness and fear, now shone with renewed hope and love. And there in that hospital room decorated festively, surrounded by her family and a very special Santa Claus, Sophie understood the true meaning of the Christmas spirit. It was not about presents or decorations, but about love, faith, and the ability to believe in miracles even in the darkest moments. The hospital room fell silent as Paul, dressed as Santa Claus, entered. His red suit and white beard contrasted vividly with the sterile environment, bringing with him an almost magical aura. Sophie held her breath, eyes wide with recognition. It was him, the same Santa to whom she had given her desperate letter the previous night. "Ho, ho, ho!" Paul exclaimed softly, his gaze gentle as it traveled around the room before resting on Claire. "I've heard there's a very brave girl here. You must be Claire." Claire, still weak but with eyes shining with curiosity, nodded timidly. "Yes, Sir Santa Claus." Paul approached the bed, his warm smile visible even through the fake beard. "Well, Claire, I have something special for you." He opened his large red sack and pulled out a package wrapped in shiny gold paper. Anne and Thomas watched, emotional and a bit confused, as Paul handed the present to Claire. Sophie, for her part, remained silent, torn between the joy of seeing her sister awake and the confusion about Santa's presence. Claire carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a beautifully illustrated book of fairy tales. Her eyes lit up. "Oh, it's lovely. Thank you, Santa Claus." Paul smiled, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You know, Claire, this book is very special. It reminds me of a story I'd like to share with you. It's about a very brave girl, not so different from you." The family gathered around the bed, intrigued. Even Sophie moved closer, her curiosity momentarily outweighing her confusion. Paul began his story, his voice soft and captivating. Once upon a time, in a snowy land, lived a girl named Hope. She lived in a small cabin with her family, and every winter they faced tough times. One day, Hope decided she would find a way to help her family. As Paul narrated, Claire listened attentively, her eyes shining. Sophie noticed how the story seemed to draw everyone into a magical atmosphere. Hope embarked on a journey through the frozen forest, Paul continued. She faced cutting winds, crossed icy rivers, and climbed slippery mountains. Many times she wanted to give up, but something inside her made her go on. Claire hugged the book against her chest, fully immersed in the tale. Anne and Thomas exchanged glances, smiles of emotion on their faces. Finally, after many challenges, Hope reached the top of the highest mountain. There, she didn't find gold or jewels, but something far more precious, the courage within herself. She realized that her journey, no matter how difficult, had made her stronger and braver than she ever imagined. Paul paused, looking directly at Claire. "You see, Claire, sometimes we face challenges that seem impossible to overcome. But in those moments, we discover our true strength. You, my dear, are like Hope. You've faced your own tough journey and come out stronger." Claire smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Santa Claus," she whispered. Sophie watched the scene, a maelstrom of emotions swirling inside her. There was something about the way Paul spoke, the kindness in his eyes, that made her feel safe and hopeful. But at the same time, she couldn't fully understand what was happening. How did he know so much about Claire? How was he here, right at that moment? Paul stood up, adjusting his red suit. "Well, I must continue my journey. There are many other children to visit today." He turned to Anne and Thomas. "You have a very special daughter here. Both of your daughters are extraordinary." Before leaving, Paul looked directly at Sophie. With a gentle smile, he gave her a discreet wink, a gesture that seemed to say, "Our secret is safe." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. That wink confirmed what she already suspected. This was not just any hospital Santa. It was the same man who had heard her plea on Christmas Eve. As Paul left, he left behind a room full of emotion and wonder. Anne wiped tears from her eyes, while Thomas seemed to struggle for words. "What a wonderful visit," Anne finally said. "The Christmas spirit in this hospital is truly amazing." Thomas nodded, still a bit stunned. "Yes, it was this. It was very special." "Claire, how are you feeling, sweetheart?" Claire smiled, holding the book tightly. "I'm happy, Dad, and I feel brave, like the girl in the story." Sophie remained silent, her mind spinning. She wanted to tell everyone about her encounter the previous night, about the letter, about how she had begged for a miracle, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the meaningful look Paul gave her, or maybe it was the fear that speaking aloud would break some sort of magical spell. While the family continued talking, marveling at the unexpected visit and Claire's miraculous recovery, Sophie allowed herself for the first time in weeks to feel real hope. Perhaps there was more magic in the world than she ever imagined. Perhaps miracles really did happen, especially at Christmas. And as she watched her sister alive and smiling, Sophie made a silent promise to herself. She would never again doubt the power of hope and love, because there, in that hospital room on Christmas Day, she had witnessed something truly magical, a miracle born of faith, love, and perhaps a touch of the holiday spirit. A week after Claire's miraculous awakening on Christmas Day, the Morgan family finally received the news they had been waiting for. Claire was ready to return home. Dr. Leclerc, with a tired but satisfied smile, gave Anne and Thomas the final instructions. Remember, Claire's recovery will be a slow process. She's still fragile and will need constant care, the doctor explained, handing over a list of recommendations and medications. Claire, sitting on the hospital bed, looked like a smaller, more delicate version of herself. Her eyes, once so lively, now carried a shadow of fatigue and confusion. Sophie observed her sister closely, noting every small change, every hesitant movement. The journey home was quiet, punctuated only by Anne's occasional sighs of relief and Thomas's gentle questions, checking if Claire was comfortable. Sophie kept her eyes on Claire, as if afraid she would vanish if she looked away for even a second. Once at home, the new reality of the Morgan family began to set in. The girls' bedroom was rearranged. Claire's bed moved downstairs for easier access. Medical equipment, once foreign and frightening, now became part of the home's decor. Sophie immediately took on the role of assistant nurse, following Claire like a shadow, anticipating every need before her sister could voice it. "Sophie, honey, you don't have to do everything by yourself," Anne said gently one afternoon, seeing her eldest daughter adjust Claire's pillows for the 5th time in an hour. "I want to help, Mom," Sophie replied, her voice full of determination. "It's the least I can do after what happened." Claire, who was flipping through the fairy tale book given by Santa Claus, looked up. "Sophie, you don't need to feel guilty. I don't remember much of what happened, but I know it wasn't your fault." Claire's memory of the accident was hazy at best. She didn't remember going to the lake or falling through the ice. Curiously, her most vivid recollection was of a recurring dream she had while in the coma. "I dreamed of a Christmas angel," Claire said one night, as Sophie helped her prepare for bed. "He had a white beard and red clothes, and he told me stories about courage and hope. It's funny, isn't it? Almost like Santa Claus really visited me." Sophie froze for a moment, vividly recalling the hospital Santa's visit. She still hadn't told anyone about her nighttime encounter or the letter. Part of her wanted to share that magical experience, but another part feared that by speaking aloud, she would break some kind of enchanted spell. "Yeah, funny," Sophie murmured, tucking the blankets around Claire. As the days passed, Anne and Thomas began to notice changes in Sophie's behavior. Their eldest daughter, once so lively and sometimes rebellious, was now the embodiment of responsibility and care. She rarely left the house, dedicating every free moment to Claire. "Do you think we should be worried?" Thomas asked Anne one night, after the girls had gone to bed. Anne sighed, rubbing her tired temples. "She went through a terrible trauma, Thomas. Maybe this is just her way of coping with guilt and relief. Let's give her time." But as weeks turned into months, tensions began to rise again in the Morgan home. The constant routine of caring for Claire, though necessary, was wearing everyone down. Thomas, overwhelmed by rising medical bills, started working extra hours. Anne, torn between caring for Claire and keeping the household running, often felt exhausted and overwhelmed. Sophie, in her tireless dedication to Claire, began to neglect her own studies and friendships. One afternoon, the tension finally boiled over. Anne, exhausted after a sleepless night caring for Claire, dropped a stack of dishes in the kitchen. "Damn it!" she shouted, tears of frustration welling up in her eyes. Sophie rushed into the kitchen, alarmed. "Mom, are you okay?" "No, Sophie, I'm not," Anne burst out, her voice trembling. "Nothing is okay. Your sister is still recovering, your father's barely home, and you don't act like a child anymore. You should be playing, hanging out with friends, not being a full-time nurse." Sophie froze, shocked by her mother's sudden outburst. But I just want to help," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. Anne immediately regretted her outburst, She knelt down, hugging Sophie tightly. "Oh, honey, I'm sorry. I know you just want to help. I'm so tired." That night, while the house slept, Sophie stayed awake, replaying the day's events in her mind. She knew things couldn't go on like this. Her family was falling apart under the weight of stress and guilt. Silently, she got up and went to her desk. Taking a sheet of paper, she began to write, "Dear Santa Claus, or whoever you really are, thank you for saving my sister. But now I need your help again. My family is suffering, and I don't know what to do. Please, if you can, help us find our way back to happiness. With hope, Sophie." Folding the letter carefully, Sophie placed it under her pillow. She didn't know if it would work again, if Santa Claus would appear once more to help, but lying there in the darkness of her room, listening to Claire's soft breathing beside her, Sophie allowed herself to believe that maybe a bit more Christmas magic was exactly what her family needed. The weeks dragged on in the Morgan home, each day bringing small progress in Claire's recovery, but also new challenges. The family struggled to return to a semblance of normality, but the shadows of the accident still hovered over them like a dark cloud. Sophie, in particular, carried an invisible burden. The decision to hide the truth about the accident from Claire had been made in a moment of panic and guilt, but now it became a corrosive secret, threatening to erode their relationship. "Sophie," Claire called one afternoon, while the two sat in the living room, Claire doing physical therapy exercises and Sophie pretending to do homework, but in reality watching her sister's every move. "Do you remember the day of the accident? Everything still seems so hazy to me." Sophie felt her heart race. She forced a smile, trying to appear casual. "Oh, not really. It all happened so fast, you know. The important thing is that you're okay now." Claire frowned, frustrated. "But how did I fall into the lake? We weren't supposed to be there, right?" I'm not sure," Sophie stammered, the weight of the lie crushing her chest. "Maybe it's better not to think about it now. Do you want me to read you a story?" The abrupt change of subject did not go unnoticed by Claire, but she did not insist. However, as days passed, she began to have confused flashbacks. The sound of cracking ice, an intense cold, Sophie's voice screaming her name. Disconnected fragments that left her uneasy and confused. One night, Claire woke up screaming, tears running down her face. Sophie rushed to her side, holding her tightly. "Shh! It's okay," Sophie whispered, stroking Claire's hair. "It was just a nightmare." Claire clung to her sister, sobbing. "It was so real, Sophie. I was on the ice, and it was breaking, and I couldn't breathe." Sophie felt as if her own heart were breaking. She desperately wanted to tell the truth, to lighten the burden of this secret. But fear of losing Claire's love and trust paralyzed her. At school, Sophie became increasingly distant and distracted. Her teachers noticed the change in her behavior, but attributed it to the traumatic experience her family had undergone. During a physical education class, things finally reached a breaking point. The class was practicing ice skating, a sport Sophie once adored. But as soon as she stepped onto the rink, she froze. Images of the accident flooded her mind. The ice breaking, Claire vanishing into the dark water, the biting cold. "Sophie, are you all right?" her teacher asked, concerned. Sophie looked around, realizing she was trembling violently, tears streaming down her face. Her classmates stared with a mixture of worry and curiosity. I can't," she whispered, before running off the rink, leaving everyone stunned. The teacher found her minutes later, huddled in a corner of the locker room, sobbing uncontrollably. "Sophie, dear, what happened?" the teacher asked gently, sitting beside her. "It was my fault," Sophie finally broke down, sobbing. "Claire's accident. It was all my fault. I convinced her to go to the lake. I should have listened when she said it was dangerous, and now I can't even look at the ice without..." The teacher hugged Sophie, letting her cry until she calmed down. "Sophie, accidents happen. You didn't want to hurt your sister, but keeping this secret is hurting you. You need to talk to your family about it." The teacher's words echoed in Sophie's mind for the rest of the day. She knew the teacher was right, that she couldn't keep carrying this burden alone. But the fear of losing Claire's trust was overwhelming. That night, lying in her bed, Sophie heard Claire tossing restlessly, probably having another nightmare. Silently, she got up and went to her sister's bedside. "Claire," she whispered, gently touching her sister's shoulder. "Having another nightmare?" Claire opened her eyes, tears glistening in the darkness. "Sophie, I remember, not everything, but we were at the lake, right? Why were we there?" Sophie felt her heart tighten. This was the moment. She could continue lying or finally face the truth, no matter the consequences. "Claire," she began, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you about the accident, about what really happened." Claire sat up in bed, her eyes fixed on Sophie. There was fear there, but also a desperate need to understand. Sophie took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. The words she had kept locked inside finally began to flow. She told Claire about her idea to go skating on the lake, about how she ignored Claire's warnings, about the terrible moment when the ice broke. As Sophie spoke, tears streamed freely down her face. She expected to see anger, disappointment, or even hatred in Claire's eyes. But when she finally dared to look at her sister, what she saw surprised her. Claire was crying too, but there was understanding in her eyes. Slowly, she reached out and took Sophie's hand. "I knew," Claire whispered. "Somehow, I always knew. But Sophie, I don't blame you. I love you. You're my sister." Claire's words were like a balm on Sophie's tormented soul. She sobbed, hugging Claire tightly. "I'm sorry, Claire, I'm so sorry." The two sisters remained embraced for a long time, letting their tears wash away the pain, guilt, and fear they had carried for so long. When they finally parted, Sophie felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She knew there was still a long road ahead, that they would have to talk to their parents and deal with the consequences of her secret. But at that moment, wrapped in the comforting darkness of their room, the Morgan sisters found the start of the healing they so desperately needed. Tension in the Morgan house had reached a critical point. Weeks of secrets, guilt, and repressed emotions finally exploded on an afternoon that seemed ordinary. Claire, frustrated with another difficult day of physical therapy, vented her irritation on Sophie. "Why are you always watching me? I'm not a baby, you know." Sophie, exhausted from her constant vigilance, snapped back, "I'm just trying to help, Claire." "You should be grateful." "Grateful," Claire retorted, her voice rising. "Grateful for what? For almost dying? For not remembering what happened?" At that moment, Sophie lost control. "You want to know what happened? Do you really want to know?" she shouted, tears of frustration in her eyes. "It was my fault. I convinced you to go to the lake that morning. I ignored you when you said it was dangerous. I almost killed you, Claire." The silence that followed was deafening. Claire stared at Sophie, her face a mixture of shock and pain. You lied to me. All this time." Sophie, realizing what she had done, tried to approach Claire. "Claire, I'm sorry. I was so afraid of losing you." But Claire moved away, tears streaming down her face. "Don't touch me. You lied to me, Sophie. How could you?" Attracted by the shouting, Anne and Thomas rushed into the living room. "What's going on here?" Thomas demanded. Between sobs, Sophie confessed everything. The plan to go to the lake, the accident, the lie she had kept for weeks. Anne and Thomas listened, horrified. "Sophie, how could you hide this from us?" Anne asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Thomas, on the other hand, was furious. "You put your sister in danger and then lied to all of us. Sophie, I'm so disappointed." The family fell into total crisis. Claire refused to speak to Sophie, locking herself in her room. Anne and Thomas argued about how to handle the situation. "She needs to be punished, Anne," Thomas insisted. "She almost killed Claire and then lied about it." "She's just a child, Thomas," Anne retorted. "She's suffering enough with guilt. Punishment won't help." Sophie, feeling completely rejected and alone, considered running away. She packed a backpack with some clothes and her favorite teddy bear. Late at night, when everyone slept, she crept to the front door. But when her hand touched the doorknob, she heard a soft sound from Claire's room. Hesitant, Sophie approached the slightly open door. Claire was sitting on her bed, crying softly. Sophie's heart broke at the sight of her sister's anguish. "Claire?" she called quietly. Claire looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "What do you want?" Sophie stepped into the room, letting her backpack fall to the floor. I was going to run away, but I can't leave you like this." The sisters stared at each other for a long moment. Then, to Sophie's surprise, Claire held out her hand. "Come here," Claire said quietly. Sophie approached, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Claire, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I love you so much." Claire sighed. "I know, Sophie. I love you too. That's why it hurts so much. You're my sister, my best friend. How did we end up here?" Claire's words opened the floodgates. Sophie began to cry again, years of guilt, fear, and love pouring out. Claire hugged her, her own tears mixing with Sophie's. They talked for hours, revisiting the accident, sharing their fears and hopes. When the sun began to rise, the Morgan sisters had taken their first step toward healing. In the following weeks, the family worked hard to rebuild their broken trust. There were difficult moments, heated arguments, and many tears. But there were also laughter, hugs, and small moments of joy that reminded everyone of the love they shared. One day, Sophie and Claire's teacher announced a school project about heroism. The sisters, seeing an opportunity to work together and strengthen their bond, decided to make the project about the firefighters who saved Claire. While researching at the local library, Sophie found a newspaper article about the rescue. Her eyes scanned the accompanying photo, showing the rescue team. Suddenly, she froze, her heart racing. There, smiling shyly for the camera, was a face she would recognize anywhere. The Santa Claus to whom she had given her desperate letter on Christmas Eve. "It can't be," Sophie murmured, shocked. "What is it?" Claire asked, noticing her sister's astonished expression. Sophie looked at Claire, her mind whirling. "Claire, do you remember that Santa Claus who visited us in the hospital on Christmas Day?" Claire frowned, thinking, "Kind of, why?" With trembling hands, Sophie pointed to the firefighter in the photo. "It's him. Santa Claus, he was one of the firefighters who saved you." Memories of that Christmas night flooded Sophie's mind. The desperate letter, the encounter on the snowy street, the promise of a miracle. Everything suddenly made sense. "Sophie, what are you talking about?" Claire asked, confused. Sophie took a deep breath and began to explain. She told Claire about the night she snuck out to deliver a letter to Santa Claus, begging for Claire's life. She described the gentle Santa who listened and comforted her, and how he appeared at the hospital the next day. Claire listened, fascinated. "So, it wasn't a dream. I really did hear stories about courage while I was in a coma." Sophie nodded, tears in her eyes. "I think so. And now we know who he really was, the firefighter who saved you." The sisters exchanged a look, a new understanding passing between them. The Christmas miracle they had experienced wasn't just magic. It was the result of real people's compassion and dedication. That night, Sophie gathered her courage and told her parents about the letter and the encounter with Santa Claus. Anne and Thomas listened, astonished, as Sophie revealed this final piece of the puzzle. "Oh, Sophie," Anne whispered, hugging her daughter. "You carried so much weight alone." Thomas, with tears in his eyes, joined the hug. "I'm proud of you, dear, for never giving up, for believing." The Morgan family came together, stronger and more united than ever. They knew there was still a long road ahead, but now they would face it together, without secrets. Sophie looked at Claire, who smiled through her tears. "What do you think about changing our project a bit?" she asked. "I think we have an amazing story to tell about true heroes." Claire nodded, squeezing Sophie's hand. "Yes, we do. And I think we need to find a certain Santa Claus firefighter to thank him." As the family began planning how to find the mysterious firefighter, Sophie felt a wave of gratitude and hope. The path to healing was long, but now she knew she wasn't alone. With her family by her side and the memory of that Christmas miracle in her heart, she was ready to face whatever came next. The Morgan family was gathered in the living room, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. After days of searching, they had finally located Paul, the retired firefighter who had played such a crucial role in their lives. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Thomas asked, looking at his daughters. Sophie and Claire exchanged determined looks before nodding in unison. "We need to know," Sophie replied, her voice firm despite her evident nerves. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, making everyone jump slightly. Anne went to answer, returning moments later with a middle-aged man, grey-haired and with a kind smile. "Hello, everyone," Paul greeted, his eyes scanning the room before resting on Claire. "It's good to see you up and about, young lady." Claire blushed slightly, a small smile on her lips. "Thank you for coming, sir." Sophie, on the other hand, couldn't take her eyes off Paul. Even without the fake beard and red suit, she recognized him instantly as the Santa Claus from that fateful night. After initial introductions, everyone sat down, a heavy silence filled with expectations settling over them. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. "You were Santa Claus, weren't you? That night in the street and then at the hospital?" Paul nodded slowly, a melancholic smile on his face. "Yes, that was me. I was surprised to receive your invitation, but I guess I always knew this day would come." "Why?" Claire asked, leaning forward. "Why did you do all that?" Paul took a deep breath before beginning his story. "That night, I was doing my annual Santa Claus round, visiting children in difficult situations. When I found Sophie, so desperate and alone, my heart just broke." He turned to Sophie, his gentle eyes on hers. "Your letter, Sophie, touched me deeply. The guilt you carried, the love for your sister, it was palpable. I knew I had to do something." "But how did you know about Claire in the hospital?" Thomas questioned. Paul smiled. "Well, being a firefighter for so many years gives you some connections. I used them to follow Claire's case. When I heard she had woken up on Christmas Day, I felt it was a sign. I had to see her, give her some hope." Claire, tears in her eyes, reached out and held Paul's hand. "I remember you, not clearly, but your voice, the stories you told, they helped me, gave me strength." Paul gently squeezed Claire's hand. "I'm glad I could help, even a little. You know, in all my years as a firefighter, I learned that sometimes hope is just as important as any rescue equipment." He then shared other rescue stories, moments when hope made all the difference. The family listened, fascinated, beginning to truly understand the impact a single act of kindness could have. Sophie, who had remained silent, finally found her voice. I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "for listening to me that night, for not judging me. I carried so much guilt." Paul stood up and knelt in front of Sophie, his eyes level with hers. "Sophie, the accident wasn't your fault. Accidents happen. What matters is how we react to them. And you, young lady, showed incredible courage." Paul's words seemed to break something inside Sophie. Tears began to stream freely down her face as she finally let go of the guilt she had carried for so long. Anne and Thomas, deeply moved, joined in a hug, enveloping their eldest daughter. Claire, with Paul's help, also approached, completing the family embrace. When they finally separated, a palpable sense of healing filled the air. The Morgan family seemed lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Claire, looking at her sister with new understanding, spoke softly. "Sophie, I never realized. You were so brave. Writing that letter, believing so strongly that you are my hero." Sophie blushed, a small smile appearing on her lips. "I just wanted to bring you back, Claire. You're my little sister. I'd do anything for you." Paul watched the scene, a satisfied smile on his face. "You two are extraordinary. The strength of the love between sisters is truly special." Thomas turned to Paul, extending his hand. "We can't thank you enough for everything you did for our family." Paul shook Thomas's hand firmly. "It was an honor to help. That's why I became a firefighter, to make a difference in people's lives." Sophie and Claire exchanged a knowing look before Sophie spoke. "Mr. Paul, we're doing a school project on heroism. We'd love for you to participate. Your story, well, we think people need to hear it." Paul's face lit up with a warm smile. "It would be an honor, girls, and please, just call me Paul." As the conversation continued, Plans were made for the school project and promises of future meetings were exchanged. There was a palpable feeling of hope and renewal in the air. The Morgan family had faced a terrible ordeal, but through it, they discovered the true strength of love, courage, and compassion. Now, with Paul as a new friend and mentor, they were ready to share their story, hoping it would inspire others to believe in miracles, both the magical kind and those born from simple acts of human kindness. The cold December air carried the scent of evergreens and the promise of snow. At the Morgan home, the atmosphere was one of anticipation and joy, a striking contrast to the previous Christmas. A year had passed since the accident that almost took Claire from them, and the family was preparing to celebrate not just Christmas, but also their journey of healing and renewal. Sophie and Claire were at the center of all the activity, dashing back and forth, finalizing the preparations for the event they had planned for months, a ceremony of gratitude for the town's emergency services. "Sophie, did you see my speech?" Claire called, rummaging through a pile of papers on the kitchen table. Sophie smiled, handing her sister a carefully organized folder. "Here it is, all set. Don't worry, you'll do great." The sisters exchanged a look of complicity. Their bond, already strong before, had deepened even further over the past year. Together, they had faced nightmares, therapy sessions, and moments of doubt, emerging stronger and more united than ever. The doorbell rang, announcing Paul's arrival. The retired firefighter had become a constant presence in the Morgans' lives, a living reminder of the miracle they had experienced. "Ready for the big day?" Paul asked, his eyes shining with paternal pride. "Almost," replied Sophie, nervously adjusting her blouse. "I just hope we can convey everything we want to say." Paul placed a reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder. "You'll do wonderfully. Your story is powerful, and most importantly, it comes from the heart." Hours later, the school auditorium was packed. Firefighters, paramedics, nurses, and doctors mingled with family members, friends, and community members. On stage, Sophie and Claire prepared to present their project on heroism. Sophie stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly as she began. "A year ago, our family went through what seemed like a tragedy. My sister, Claire, almost lost her life in an accident. But through that experience, we learned the true meaning of heroism." She then shared, for the first time publicly, the story of the letter to Santa Claus and the mysterious visitor at the hospital. Many in the audience wiped tears as Sophie described her despair and the subsequent magical visit that brought hope. But the real miracle, Sophie continued, was not magical. It was the result of the tireless dedication of real people, the firefighters who risked their lives to save my sister, the paramedics who fought to keep her alive, the doctors and nurses who never gave up. Claire then joined her sister on stage, her living, healthy presence, a powerful testament to the story they were telling. "Each of you is a hero," Claire said, her voice clear and emotional. "Not because you have superpowers, but because you choose, every day, to put others' needs above your own." The ceremony continued with emotional tributes. Firefighters, paramedics, and healthcare professionals were called on stage to receive certificates of gratitude, each accompanied by a personal story of how they had impacted lives. Paul, as the guest of honor, gave a moving speech about the importance of compassion and hope in emergency work. His eyes shone with pride as he looked at Sophie and Claire, the girls who had touched his heart so deeply. Then, to everyone's surprise, Claire asked for the microphone again. "I wrote something," she said shyly. "A poem about my experience. I'd like to share it, if I may." The auditorium fell silent as Claire began to read. In the deepest darkness, a light shone, gentle hands that warmed my cold body, voices of hope echoed in my sleep, an angel dressed in red, a dream so deep. Heroes without capes, hearts of pure gold, fought for my life, precious and untold. My sister, my beacon in the darkest storm, her unshaken faith my shelter warm. Today I stand here, alive and grateful, for each second chance that life grants fateful. To all of you who never gave in, my heart and life forever dwell within. There wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium when Claire finished. Sophie hugged her sister, both crying and laughing at once. Christmas Eve arrived, bringing with it a sense of peace and gratitude that permeated the Morgan home. The family, including Paul, gathered for a festive dinner, the table laden not just with food, but with stories, laughter, and a profound sense of connection. Later, as everyone relaxed in the living room, Sophie slipped quietly upstairs. From a carefully guarded box, she retrieved a folded piece of paper, her original letter to Santa Claus. Rereading the desperate words she had written a year ago, Sophie was overwhelmed by a wave of emotions. How different she felt now. The guilt and fear had given way to gratitude and understanding. "Sophie?" Claire's voice brought her back to the present. "What are you doing?" Sophie smiled, showing the letter to her sister. "Just remembering how much we've changed, how much we've grown." Claire sat beside Sophie, reading the letter over her shoulder. "Wow," she whispered. "You really never gave up on me, did you?" "Never," Sophie replied, hugging Claire. "And I never will." The sisters remained silent for a moment, absorbing the depth of their bond. Then Claire spoke again, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Hey, I have an idea. What if we dress up as Santa's helpers and visit the kids at the hospital? You know, spread some Christmas cheer." Sophie's face lit up. "Claire, that's brilliant. We can ask Paul for help. I'm sure he'd love to join." The girls raced downstairs, eager to share their idea with the family. When they explained their plan, they were met with enthusiastic smiles and immediate offers of assistance. "That's wonderful, girls," Anne said, tears of pride shining in her eyes. "You really understand the spirit of Christmas." Paul, with a broad grin, added, "I know a few people at the hospital who can help us set this up. How about we make it a new tradition?" And so, as snow began to fall softly outside, the Morgan family, along with Paul, started planning their new Christmas adventure. What had begun as a tragedy had transformed into an opportunity to spread hope and joy to others. Sophie looked around the room, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. She thought of all the trials they had faced, the hard lessons learned about forgiveness, courage, and the transformative power of family and community love. The accident had nearly taken Claire from them, but instead it brought them closer, not just as a family, but as part of a larger community. They had discovered heroes in unexpected places and, in the process, found heroic strength within themselves. As the family continued to excitedly plan, Sophie silently renewed her promise, not just to Claire, but to everyone around her. She promised to keep this spirit of gratitude and generosity alive, not just at Christmas, but every day. Because now she understood, true miracles don't happen only once a year. They happen every day, in small acts of kindness, in moments of courage, and in the love we share with one another. And with that thought, Sophie joined her family, ready to embark on their new chapter, a chapter of hope, healing, and the enduring magic of the Christmas spirit.